China's great river, YANGTSE, the Long River, known to the rest of us as the Yangtze Kiang, rises in the Kunlun Mountains of the autonomous region of Tibet at around 17,000 feet and plunges south and east for the entire length of the third largest country on Earth. Its length, 3,434 miles, makes it the fourth longest river in the world. Its middle courses rage through gorges up to 2,000 feet in depth, and its lower course meanders through the granary of China onto the lower plains feeding the Great Lakes and passing through the major city of Wuhan. Gathering up water from scores of tributaries, the Yangtze Kiang pours its contents into the East China Sea at the rate of 2 million cubic feet per second. This area of the Yangtze is navigable to ocean-going craft, but the upper reaches through northern Sichuan and Qinghai are impassable. Boats can't go there. The key to unlocking this great river was an invention made in England, born and tested on the Solent, the Hovercraft. So, in the summer of 1990, the river was visited by the British Hovercraft expedition to China. The expedition had been 8 years in the planning. Squadron leader Michael Cole, seen here on the right, had been assembling the right caliber of people, together with suitable sponsorship, since 1982.
It has been quite horrific, but obviously a very meaningful experience for them. Picking up the destitute and the dying on the streets and seeing them die within the next 48 hours.
Men like Dick Bell, former RAF fighter pilot instructor at Cranwell. Tim Longley, an aeronautical design engineer. John Gifford, on the right, hovercraft manufacturer from Southampton, and Dr. Bill Gould, a GP from Brixham. And Dr. Mel Richardson, a senior lecturer in plastics and polymers at Loughborough University and deputy leader of the expedition. Mike Cole had led several team members on previous expeditions to Nepal, Africa and South America. Motivated by Christian beliefs, they'd succeeded in establishing a hover doctor service in Peru on the previous expedition along the Amazon in 1985. The expedition to China was to be three-pronged. First, adventure. We were to have a lot of that. Second, medical, a team of doctors led by Dr. Rachel Pinniger, a pediatrician who'd spent 12 years working in Bhutan, had put together a wide-ranging medical program which included seminars and projects relating to child health care. The cornerstone of this was a vaccination program for the children of China against 6 killer diseases: whooping cough, diphtheria, tetanus, polio, tuberculosis and measles. UNICEF and the World Health Organization were to cooperate and advise. The third aim was scientific. Dr. Richardson of Loughborough University was to introduce and test various materials in situ on the river, the resulting research to be shared with the Chinese Academy of Science and Chengdu University.
Well, we've got the black portion is the deck material, same as on the river over, and we're trying to see how the different levels of adhesion compare.
So in September 1989, the team were able to announce a start date for the expedition. They met at Southampton for the delivery of the larger craft from the sponsor. Sir Christopher Cockrell, the inventor of the hovercraft, was there as the craft was shown to the team. Dick Bell, who was to write the book of the expedition, To the Source of the Yangtze, started to gather his facts. Mike Cole accepted the keys to the craft from Thomas Frank, an executive of the sponsor.
The expedition team. And God bless all the people who will sail on her. And now I'd like you, Mike, to help me and give her the name Neste Enterprise.
Please go ahead.
Okay.
On On Southampton Water, the smaller hovercraft, ICI River Rover, was being fine-tuned. But the expedition's engineers had a problem. How would the craft's petrol engine behave at 16,500 feet? The Royal Armaments Research and Development Establishment at YANGTSE came to the rescue. RADE, as it's known, has a giant climatic and altitude chamber, which would enable the craft to operate in conditions it would encounter at high altitude on the River Yangtze. The expedition's chief engineer, Tim Longley, explained the problem.
Well, basically, because the expedition needs to go up to about 16,000 feet above sea level, where the air is only about half as thick, putting it in layman's terms, as it is at sea level. Therefore, the engine of the hovercraft can only deliver about not much more than 2/3 the power at that sort of altitude than it can at sea level. So what we've done is we've put a much more powerful engine in to start with, so that by the time we get up to high altitude, we still have enough power to drive the craft. I suppose the radiator boiling is the most probable snag that we're likely to encounter, because of course water boils at a lower temperature the higher you go up, and we just don't know really what the engine is designed for, and we could encounter those sort of snags of radiator boiling.
The air in the chamber is evacuated from it until the pressure reaches a predetermined level at which the test is to be made. This process can be varied in stages, so engine and human performances, for that matter, can be tested and monitored.
Carry on going. Just keep on going and they'll tell you when to stop. Okay, hold it there.
Holding it there. RPM is 4,200.
4,200.
Check.
Boost. Right, boost.
Boost. Turbo boost. 3. 1, 2, 3.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Okay, you can slow it down.
Okay, bring it down slowly.
The tests revealed that further modifications were needed for the engine to perform efficiently over 14,000 feet. On the last recce to China in December '89, the expedition signed an agreement with the Chinese sponsors and authorities and left a deposit to confirm they would return for the expedition proper 2 months later. And in February, the main team flew into Hong Kong's Kai Tak Airport, unaware that the next 4 months would bring difficulty, frustration, hardship, and near disaster. Hong Kong is not the ideal place to prepare for the stark realities of Qinghai Province and Tibet. But it was here, in the privileged surroundings of the Royal Hong Kong Yacht Club and City Hall, that the expedition had organised a press conference and reception.
How are we getting there? The craft go back into containers, will go by rail to Chengdu. The team will fly to Chengdu, and then it's 7 days torturous.
Radio, television and press were all present, along with Hong Kong's great and good. What they didn't know was that 20 minutes before it started, a telex had arrived from Beijing. It had said, permission for the expedition in China has not been granted, and the Hong Kong press conference and reception must be cancelled. But that was impossible. The press were waiting, and 300 people were to be hosted at the reception. So the telex was ignored, and the day proceeded as planned. At Queen's Pier, Mike Cole was received by Major General Ian Duffel, Commander-in-Chief of British Forces in Hong Kong.
What's the latest one? The latest British invention, I think.
He was shown ICI River Rover, which was on display close by.
It's always been a philosophy of mine to encourage soldiers in pursuit of endeavour to go to the cliff edge and attempt to fly. And it therefore gives me very great pleasure to be associated with Michael Cole's 1990 Hovercraft expedition to China, which is attempting in a very positive way to do just that.
But we were about to learn our first lesson that one should never allow the Chinese to lose face. Our goals, aims and future plans had, through the publicity we generated, reached the eyes and ears of the authorities in Beijing, and they didn't like it one little bit. 2 days later, an advance party of 6 people led by Dr. Richardson took the train to Guangzhou and from there flew to Chengdu in Sichuan province. The team booked into the Jinjiang Hotel, and a few hours later a meeting was called with the Sichuan Mountaineering Association, the Chinese sponsor which had received our deposit and signed our expedition contract. The team were told that the expedition was off and we should all return home immediately. 8 years of planning, 170 or so sponsors to satisfy, hundreds of church members in the United Kingdom praying for our success, and we were being asked to go home. It took a few minutes to realize the implications. 10 of our team in Hong Kong, 12 more in the air from Gatwick due any day, and the whole project seemed over before it had begun. Expedition leader Mike Cole elected to send the rest of the team to Chengdu and dispatch 3 containers from Hong Kong by rail, a 7-day journey, during which time renegotiations would begin. This advance party were eventually in Chengdu 6 weeks instead of the planned 3 days, talking about permits to proceed. Hotels are expensive. To save money, the expedition moved to the West China Medical University campus a mile away. This enabled the team to meet and get to know the students. At this time, filming was restricted, but we were able to film our sports activities with the students. Young people in China crave a new political system. They see Western culture as being the ideal. Freedom of choice, fair opportunity for all. Many speak a smattering of English, and one is likely to be asked for denim jeans and Bibles. Yes, they see the West as a Christian community, and if the culture is to be embraced, then religion is to be accepted as part of it. The team made many friends here, but the attitude of the authorities was obstructive and expensive. The containers arrived from Hong Kong, but the Chengdu authorities denied their existence. How then do you go about taking the customs men to see containers which don't officially exist? It took time to achieve without them losing face. Gradually, the reason for the hold-up emerged. Our expedition contract, signed in December '89, was, according to the Chinese, not a contract, but a letter of intent. This wasn't shifting the goalposts, it was moving the pitch. Giles Wadsworth, one of the expedition's interpreters, explained the Chinese point of view.
The Chinese are a proud people, very fond of their own country. China in Chinese means the Middle Kingdom, the centre of the world, and everyone outside are the barbarians, traditionally. And to some extent, I feel probably still are slightly. Chinese are very fond of themselves, their national culture, their heritage, their history, their literature, and particularly their language. Being here for a year, 4 years ago, by the end of the year, I fought the Chinese every day throughout the year. I was thoroughly sick of it, and I went home with a very disenchanted view of China, and particularly the Chinese. I came back on this expedition particularly to try and learn to love the Chinese for who they are, for the people that they are, and they are a super nation in general, and their individuals can be great fun and get on really well. But it's been harder than I anticipated, and loving the Chinese means loving the system. China's always going to wind us up. It's wound up businessmen for years. China will always wind up the foreigner because they like to do things their way here.
Our Chinese sponsor should have registered the original contract with the central authorities in Beijing. They hadn't done so. No wonder Beijing had been sensitive about our Hong Kong press conference. So we had to find another sponsor to replace them. The Sichuan Foreign Affairs Office helped, but it still took 2 weeks for the Chinese Academy of Science to agree to sponsor, and there was a price to pay. The major decisions about the expedition's progress would now be made in Beijing. Norwegian Dr. Arne Brandsetter interpreted for the renegotiations.
So I certainly learned that the Chinese mind has to work in a very bureaucratic environment, and that they're not free to make decisions in the way that we would be back in the West. All the time they have to look to their superiors, and they have to look to the number of rules and regulations that apply in the field that they're discussing. And they have to get all the facts before they can make a decision, and they have to get approval from the superiors. So they, in actual fact, they're not free to make their own decisions.
Only 6 of the team were involved in negotiating the contract. The rest found different ways to keep morale high. Looking back on this formation cycling, it seems both absurd and eccentric. But at the time, it was an example of how the British rise above adversity. But every day we stayed in Chengdu, the cost was going up.
Guides, we're assuming 8 guides here. Food in camp is new, and insurance and accommodation in camp. Roughly speaking, subtotal 300,000.
As the negotiations continued, the expedition eventually managed to get the containers released from the rail yard to the university campus where we were staying. At last, we were able to unpack equipment and stores and make the hovercraft ready for the road journey to the river. We'd reached agreement with several relevant organizations, but the main contract could not be signed until the permit was granted from Beijing.
It's wonderful in life to get something for nothing, and that's exactly what we get with solar refrigerations. The energy is free.
The medical team had brought solar-powered refrigerators to keep the vaccines at the correct temperature. These were to be used by the expedition and then donated to various health authorities. But arrangements made over 2 previous visits started to sour. People stopped talking to us, and agreements were altered without consultation. The equipment was in short supply and much in demand. Attempts were made to hijack the equipment for other purposes. For Dr. Bill Gould, the delay in sorting this out meant that he was never to see the River Yangtze. Dr. Padman Ratnasar, an ear, nose and throat specialist from London on the right, and Norwegian interpreter Dr. Brandsetter also never saw the river. They were all out of time and had to return to Europe. The medical project itself was drastically cut from 2.5 months to 3 days. Six weeks behind schedule, with mounting debts and the medical program decimated, the governor of Sichuan province decided to give the team an audience and official send-off. Mike Cole cut through the red tape, but the irony of this bizarre occasion was that permission still hadn't been granted, and we weren't going anywhere. In the event, the permit came through a few days later, and at last we were able to go to the river. Up to the last minute, more changes were levied by our new sponsor, the Chinese Academy of Science. More drivers we didn't need, extra guides we didn't want. Expedition bursar Andrew Sneller, whom we'd nicknamed Renminbi after the local currency, sat and penciled the columns and added the cost. 7 or 8 days of dangerous travel by road through the Kholashan Mountains lay ahead, but the sigh of relief at leaving Chengdu reached monsoon proportions. We had triumphed over the unforeseen. Now we had to address the challenge we'd prepared for, the mighty Yangtze and reaching its source. The convoy moved steadily out of Chengdu and travelled west via Yahan and Hanyuan. Peter Gunner, a Sussex farmer from Lewis, had designed a special trailer for the Nestle Enterprise, the larger craft. It had a rear steering mechanism which proved invaluable round the narrow village roads and sharp bends of the mountains. The team would come to rely on Peter's trailer a lot more over the next few weeks. It wasn't long before it was put to the test. 2 hours out of Yahan, there was a landslide. The trailer's rear wheels were actually over the edge. Unknown to spectators and team members, the slide continued around them as they grappled with the problem. It was only by the grace of God that most of the people on the left of the craft were not crushed to death. Steve Moody, a garage owner from Bristol, and Peter jacked up the rear axle, and we all leaned on it to reposition the wheel on the track. The recovery took an hour, and the expedition was once again underway. Soon the rich vegetation of the Chengdu plain was left behind. Through Luding, and a brief stop at the famous bridge where Chiang Kai-shek's troops fought with the nationalists during the Civil War, and then up into the mountains. On these passes, the temperatures varied from plus 20 degrees centigrade to minus 10 degrees centigrade. After 4 days, we reached Managanga. Here, the main party headed northwest for Dunker, and a smaller party southwest for Durga to rendezvous with a medical party. Both groups became stranded in the Kholashan Mountains. The main party spent the night digging themselves out of the Haiji Pass. The other group were caught in an avalanche at 16,500 feet in the Khola Pass. They spent 7 hours on the mountain and didn't get off until 2 o'clock in the morning. At Durga, this group teamed up with the medical program. 500 children were to be vaccinated against tuberculosis, measles, whooping cough, polio, diphtheria and tetanus. Dr. Ray Pinniger also conducted seminars for the local medical authorities.
Dr. Joe, so here we have, to start with, the actual solar panel. Okay, and the sun is going to shine down on here.
The team delivered solar-powered refrigerators to the hospital and instructed the staff how to use and maintain them.
And into the battery box here. Okay? And the battery box is then charged with the electricity from the panel.
Fiona Rhodes, the expedition's veterinary, advised how yaks could be used to carry these fridges into the mountains so that vaccines could reach villages in remote areas. 3 days of valuable medical work was accomplished at Durga, all that remained of an intended 2.5-month program. But from now on, our medical activities were to be unofficial, as the Chinese frowned upon them. Meanwhile, the main party had reached the river Yangtze and set up camp at Dunker. The bank had to be cleared of rocks to enable the hovercraft to be launched. This took 14 of us 10 hours with a little help from the locals. The engineers prepared the hovercraft for their first action on the Yangtze. The local Tibetan people were friendly, and the mayor assisted Michael Cole in launching ICI River Rover on the Yangtze for the first time. A 1,000 people from many miles around came to see the launch. They'd never encountered Europeans or hovercraft before, and they'd never seen anything move from land to river and go upstream against the flow. Our camp at Dunker was a Buddhist holy ground. All the stones in the wall surrounding it were engraved with Buddhist prayers and slogans. It was against this backdrop that the expedition held its Christian Sunday morning worship.
You came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones...
There is still much religious persecution in China, and yet these pictures were transmitted nationally on China television news.
There was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it.
For several days, the hovercraft were tested on the river. We learned a lot about them, the river, and ourselves. The river at Dunker was about 100 yards wide. At this point, it marked the division between Sichuan province and the autonomous region of Tibet. We climbed on the Tibetan side to get a view of what lay ahead. From the vantage point, the area looked like a giant table board game. It gave us a fascinating insight into the makeup of the river. 1 minute it would be 50 yards wide and 200 feet deep. Half an hour later, it would be 20 miles wide and several inches deep and multi-channel. The team were now involved in tasks to make ready for the 2 final test runs for the hovercraft, one upriver, one downriver. Piloting a hovercraft downstream is altogether different from moving upstream. The craft can reach 45 to 50 miles per hour with the currents, and a hovercraft can't be steered like a car. It tends to drift round the bends. Experience was needed to cope with these conditions, and we were about to have it. The river 20 miles downstream from Dunker moved through a huge valley. We edged through it with Dick Bell at the controls. 1 minute the water was manageable. Dr. Richardson was out on deck discussing scientific projects with Sam Brooks. Then, suddenly, the water quickened. We pulled up and Mike and Rob went to investigate. As the river narrowed, it turned in a large left-hand sweep into the valley. After deliberation, it was decided to proceed with caution. Round the next bend, the river had changed character. The first warning of trouble was a huge wave which drenched Mr. Li Ming-fu, our cameraman. Nesty Enterprise was now moving faster in turbulent water, and Dick was searching for the best flow. Suddenly, we were engulfed by giant waves, and we were all thrown to the deck. There was a dull thud, and the crew were rolling around the cabin like marbles. We'd hit a rock, and the Enterprise was unstable in the water. Some of the crew instinctively climbed onto the outer deck. Only Michael Cole, who was navigating, and Dick were still in their seats. Then, Dick's voice could just be heard above the noise, and the news wasn't good.
Sorry, we got another one, guys. Can't do anything about it. Nothing about it.
A moment later, a second bang on the port side as the craft smashed against another rock. We'd lost hovering facility as air escaped from the ruptured skirt. It was now virtually a raft at the mercy of the river. Dick managed to maneuver the craft to the Tibetan side of the river, and we found a tiny sandy bank. It was too steep to beach her on, but we were out of the main current, which was running at around 15 knots. We hauled her up as far as she would go and assessed the damage to forward and port sections. Repairing the damage would take several hours. Sam Brooks and Anne Hart walked back up the river to try and stop ICI River Rover, an hour behind us, from meeting with the same misfortune. Mike Cole was philosophical.
Well, you could call that the rapid too far, one too far. We were going so well and opened up the whole length of this river, and then we hit this one with a rock barrier, really, and there was no way that we could have driven our way through, and we've sustained damage, but not fatal damage. I'm amazed at the flexibility of the team, the things they're using now to put the craft back on the river. It really is. They've bounced back tremendously. This is an expedition, it's not an outing, and we've taken the technology to the limits, and in a way I'm glad we have. We now know what we can't do, and we look forward to tackling other stretches of this river, which we know we can do.
When we started again, the repairs held just 15 minutes, and with more rapids ahead, YANGTSE Enterprise was beached on the opposite bank. Dick and David Langley stayed with the craft overnight. The rest of us spent 5.5 hours in the saddle, returning to Dunker for spares and reinforcements. The journey back, 2 hours of which was in total darkness along narrow ledges, was almost as frightening as the river journey. We arrived back at Dunker well past midnight to discover Anne Hart had already returned and left again for the stricken craft. The following day, as engineers Neil Smith and Jim Moody set about repairing the damage, a curious audience looked on as repairs were carried out to the skirt and the decking. 3 days later, Dick and Rob nursed the craft back upriver to Dunker. While the craft was being repaired, 6 of the team were invited to the local school. The wife of Rob Watson, one of the Hovercraft pilots, is a school teacher in Suffolk. She'd encouraged her primary school children to write letters to the children of Chinese schools. Loshi Region School at Dunker turned out with half the village to chant, "Welcome foreigners." Later, they sang and danced for us. The atmosphere was infectious, and the team was soon joining in. We exchanged gifts and presented the children's letters, and another bond was made. The medical team were quietly going about their work, and the Tibetan people came from miles around to visit our ad hoc surgeries in camp. Our Chinese minders wouldn't share our camp facilities. This enabled the medical staff to work unhindered during the evenings. The Chinese won't readily admit that there's a need for medical initiatives, for to do so would be to lose face. But in these remote areas of their empire, we found many needs. Dr. David Langley found this leprosy sufferer less than a mile from our camp. He was a flour miller and had suffered for many years. It was families like this that we'd come to help. More than once we were threatened with closure if we persisted, so the work was kept low profile.
Plugs in here. And now we can switch on and let the software take the information we have.
Let's roll the program. This data's looking very interesting. There's a very wide temperature extreme.
The scientific program continued with Mel Richardson and Sam Brooks. Further wreckage upriver indicated obstructions even hovercraft can't surmount, so it was nearly time to leave Dunker by road to put the craft back in the river higher up and set off for Camp 2 at Chumalai. An advance party had been there for 2 weeks, but it was to take the main party several days to reach them and get back onto the river. Although this was frustrating, it had its compensations. Shiewu was in the middle of a 3-day Buddhist festival. The temple was several hundred feet up on a ledge overlooking the town. The expedition team were made honoured guests. They sat through 3 hours of enjoyable music and colourful ritual. Though some of the musicians seemed to wilt under the strain, and others seemed to be on autopilot. At Yushu, we were invited inside the temple to witness daily prayers. Although the prayers were in written form, the monks chanted them from memory, all entranced, seeking their own experiences of divine being. This state, when reached, enables those who pray to be liberated from fear and anxiety. The Buddhist religion lays great emphasis on knowledge of being and understanding oneself, rather than union with the Supreme Spirit, as in Western religions. Buddhists believe their prayers are taken on the winds to their God, so prayer wheels waft the spoken word, and huge tents made up of written prayers await the work of the natural breezes. The journey to Chumalai was proving difficult. The expedition was now running out of time. The numerous delays and frustrations had ruled out all prospect of the whole team reaching the source. The convoy encountered 61 repair works in a 70-kilometre stretch of track. It took us 14 hours to slog through it, leaving the track and going overland when we encountered obstacles. Much pushing, digging and towing just about kept us on course for Chumalai. Chumalai lies at the end of a 7-hour journey across an isolated escarpment. The dirt road finishes here. This terminus town is several kilometres from the river YANGTSE. An old quarry track served to bring us once again to the banks of the river. The land journey to circumnavigate the rapids had taken us 8 days. There was now much to do. Final tests on the repaired hovercraft and the laying down of fuel dumps at 2 points upriver. Original planning called for an advance camp upriver at Totoha, but because our schedule had slipped, we were to make an attempt on the source from Chumalai. The team were ready, but a routine inspection uncovered a bit of a problem with the prop.
It's more than a bit of a problem. We've got quite a serious crack appearing down the centre of the blade here, which could be quite serious. It comes through both sides, so it's a right-through crack. The blade itself is mahogany, and we're going to need to do something about this. It's quite a problem.
What are the implications if we can't actually solve this?
Well, it's basically the end of the expedition as far as Neste Enterprise is concerned. We've really got to strap the top round here, close the crack up to reduce the stress at the crack tip. If we can do that, I think we've got a sporting chance of continuing. But we have got a blade which is rotating very fast, probably in excess of 400 miles per hour at the tip. So we've got a really serious problem of strapping up, sticking and making it stay for the duration of the attempt to the source.
Temporary repairs were made to the prop, and Cole gathered the team for a source briefing.
This is quite a historic moment in what I call 10 years adventure with a purpose. Now, you may think that we're chucking away the concept of adventure with a purpose by going for the source, which after all is a little bit like climbing Everest, but because it's there. But we're not doing that really, because as you all know, it's 2,000 miles journey which Duncan is going to set out by vehicle tomorrow, and it's just 200 miles by river. So we have a concept of reducing a week's journey down to 1 day.
The success of this journey depended on strategically placed fuel dumps between Chumalai and the source. Neste Enterprise delivered the fuel, and thankfully the prop held fast. The following Sunday was the last one all the team were to spend together. Morning worship was led by the expedition chaplain, Kevin Menzel, a curate from Ditton near Maidstone.
In a matter of weeks from now, most of us will be back home, to family and friends, to hot running water, bacon for breakfast, But just imagine, for some reason, you were marooned in China, in the wilds of Qinghai province, perhaps. Away from home.
The congregation's thoughts and aspirations were as diverse as the river itself. Some would be returning to Hong Kong. They too were out of time. The others would be resuming their quest for the Yangtze source. The following Wednesday, the source team left Chumalai and headed upriver. This was the first time in more than 3 months that the expedition was free of Chinese bureaucracy. After 2 hours, we ran into some bad weather. The weather pattern was now swinging from minus 10 degrees centigrade blizzards to plus 30 degrees centigrade sunshine. We hardly recognized Fuel Dump A through the snow. We picked up David Langley and Sarah Mather and dropped them at Fuel Dump B with Fiona Rhodes. They were to stay with this fuel for a week to ensure our safe return from the source. We made steady progress until early afternoon, when we encountered another rapid. This time, we were moving upstream, so we would have more control, but Rob and Mike still opted for a recce.
If you speed up, you can get up on the inside, but that'll be quite a problem if you've got to turn quickly. And we've got to keep well over hump on the corner there, so...
Yes, initially I thought the other side would be okay, but there's too many waves that we'd have to go through. Plus, there's a time just there after you've been knocked back by the waves.
There's a large rock there.
Both craft were unloaded with people and light equipment, and we tested our strategy. First, ICI River Rover, which was the more manoeuvrable of the two craft. Dick chose the water well, and the craft proceeded carefully through the rapid. Then, Nesty Enterprise, with just Rob and Jim on board, struggled up the rapid. The craft almost gave up. Just when it seemed it would succumb to the Yangtze flow and be swept back down onto the rocks, she picked up and eased her way through. It took the two hovercraft 15 minutes to climb the rapid, and the crew an hour and a half to pick their way round the bank to be reunited with them. The two craft headed for Totoha, a small army garrison town on the Golmud to Lhasa road, the only road within 1,200 miles. At this stage, the river opens out into a floodplain, running into several rivulets. We were searching for the bridge at Totoha, where two of the team who had driven from Chumalai 10 days earlier were manning a fuel dump. With just 2 hours fuel left, we spotted the bridge in the distance. This was Totoha.
This is an auspicious moment, I tell you, for this expedition.
No, it wasn't. Sometime during the past 8 hours, we'd gone the wrong way and left the main flow and proceeded southwest. We'd met the north-south Lhasa road, but 60 kilometers further south. If there hadn't been a bridge here, we would have travelled 2 more hours into the wilderness and run out of fuel. 2 expedition members waved down a passing lorry to Totoha, and 20 hours later, with fresh fuel supplies brought to us by the Chinese army, the two craft edged slowly into Totoha. The following morning, and with time now very much against us, both craft headed for Galadangdong. The country past Totoha was stark, remote and forbidding. No more bridges, buildings, very few people, and hardly any vegetation. It felt strange leaving all the trappings of daily living behind. We made steady progress upriver. A herd of wild horses was all we saw of anything all day. But ICI River Rover was having problems with her cooling system. Twice we stopped for repairs, and then late in the afternoon the system failed. Although operating in minus 10 degrees centigrade, the engine was permanently overheating. She had exceeded her altitude trial targets, but ICI River Rover was to play no further part. The mother of all blizzards descended on us during the night. We were all mentally and physically tired. Faces were blistered, the fingers of our hands were split at the nails. No yakdung fires this morning, just the tiny hexamine stoves to warm a rolled oat sachet and a drink. We couldn't move for 4 hours because of ice and fog. cross the river, Dick and his team prepared for their downstream return to Totohach. YANGTSE Enterprise eventually continued upriver. We were about 7 hours from the source. Today was to be make or break. As events unfolded, it turned out to be a bit of both. The sun burnt off the fog, and during the morning we made good headway. The river was placid and easier to follow than the previous day, but the YANGTSE hadn't finished with us yet. Just after midday, our sole remaining craft swayed violently out of control and came to rest on some small rocks facing the opposite way to that which we'd been travelling. An inspection revealed two things had snapped, an alternator belt and a skirt shift cable. The former affected all the electronics on board, and the latter serviced the steering controls. We'd used up all our spares, so Rob and Jim set about temporary repairs with nylon cord.
That's the wire that's parted, and we've got to replace it in order to really control the craft's movement. We can get round corners if I go round very slowly, but of course that'll inhibit our whole movement.
2 hours later we continued, but the temporary repairs didn't hold for long. Some crew members were stationed on the deck to assist balance, because Rob was now piloting the craft with a split main prop, no electronic power, and only 1/3 of the steering at his disposal. In addition, he requested the cabin crew to move between port and starboard every time he negotiated a bend. At 4:30, we came to the ice floe. The river channel narrowed, ice built up on the banks. It was mid-June, but there was still plenty of snow at 16,000 feet near Mount Galadangdong, the glacial source of the river YANGTSE. There was now more ice and snow than there was river channel. We'd reached the navigable source of the river for Hovercraft. At this time of the year, a small canoe would have made further inroads to the glacier, but from here on the ice went uphill into the mountain. The expedition had made it, the first people to navigate the YANGTSE against the flow, the first ever to hover petrol and diesel engines at 16,000 feet. But this was an adventure with a purpose. It was about people more than machines. Engineers and designers, opening up new frontiers in technology. Medical people who overcame disappointment to offer help and expertise.
I certainly think as an experience it would be well worth repeating. I think if we were to have another medical program, we would need to have it very clearly laid out with the Chinese and to have their full cooperation as well as their understanding on what we were hoping to achieve. We were a little bit disappointed that they didn't want us to treat Chinese, but in fact the people came to us themselves. And I think we would like to have more freedom to do that sort of thing in areas where it was necessary.
It was about scientists who shared their knowledge and technology with the people of China.
The most satisfying thing really is the personal relationships with people, with the various scientists and groups and people. We didn't have an easy time all the time, but looking back, friendships have been forged. I regularly get letters coming to me every week from China and writing back. And I think it's those personal relationships and the feeling that you're helping people that are your friends, and likewise they're helping me. It's a two-way thing. I think really is the most satisfying part, very satisfying to me personally.
And it was about the team, whose faith sustained them through the culture shock of the Orient and the challenge of the mighty river YANGTSE. And finally, the Chinese and Tibetan people, who were both a delight and a frustration, and about whom we learnt a great deal. Returning from the source, YANGTSE Enterprise covered the journey back to Chumalai with one overnight stop in 12 hours 54 minutes. The same journey by road would have taken 8 days. Adventure with a purpose, as Mike Cole called it, had left a legacy for the Chinese to think about and from which to benefit, if they wished.